The crystal chandeliers of the Beverly Hills Hotel's Crystal Ballroom cast shimmering light across Hollywood's most powerful elite as they celebrated the wrap party for Dean Martin's latest film. March 23, 1978. Al Pacino stood near the ornate bar, nursing a scotch and observing the controlled chaos of industry royalty at play. At 38, he was no longer the unknown theater actor who'd stumbled into The Godfather. But in this room, surrounded by legends who'd built Hollywood before he was born, he still felt like the kid from the South Bronx watching gods at their games. But tonight, the gods were about to discover that the kid had grown into something far more dangerous than they'd imagined. The party was in full swing, a celebration of old Hollywood glamour where tuxedos were mandatory and every conversation carried the weight of million-dollar deals. Dean Martin held court at one end of the room, his legendary charm drawing admirers like moths to flame. Sammy Davis Jr. entertained a circle of starlets with impromptu impressions that had them crying with laughter. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, expensive perfume, and the particular energy that came when people who wielded real power decided to relax. And then there was Frank Sinatra. The chairman of the board commanded the center of the ballroom like a king holding court, surrounded by a constantly shifting circle of admirers, sycophants, and industry power brokers who understood that 5 minutes of Frank's attention could change careers. At 62, Sinatra remained the undisputed emperor of entertainment, a man whose voice had defined American music, whose acting had earned critical acclaim, and whose personal magnetism could fill any room he entered. Al watched from the bar as Sinatra worked the crowd with the effortless confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own importance. Every gesture was calculated for maximum effect, every smile designed to remind observers that they were in the presence of greatness. When Frank Sinatra spoke, people listened. When he laughed, others joined in. When he moved, the entire party seemed to orbit around his trajectory. "Quite a show, isn't it?" said a voice beside Al. He turned to see Robert Mitchum, the legendary actor whose gravelly voice and hard-living reputation had made him one of Hollywood's most respected figures. Mitchum nodded toward Sinatra's circle with the knowing smile of someone who'd observed this performance countless times. "Frank's never met a room he couldn't own," Mitchum continued, taking a long sip of his drink. "Been watching him do this dance for 30 years. Still impressive, even if you know all the steps." Al nodded, understanding exactly what Mitchum meant. There was something mesmerizing about watching a master performer in his element, even when that element was a Beverly Hills party rather than a concert stage or movie set. "Different generation," Al said quietly. "Different approach to the craft." "That's putting it diplomatically," Mitchum replied with a chuckle. "Frank's from the era when entertainers were supposed to entertain, not analyze every emotion to death. He sees you method acting types as," Mitchum paused, searching for the right words, "unnecessarily complicated." Before Al could respond, the sound of Frank's laughter cut through the party noise like a knife through silk. But this wasn't his usual charming chuckle, this was the kind of laugh that suggested someone was about to become the target of the chairman's famous wit. Speaking of unnecessarily complicated, Sinatra's voice carried across the ballroom, his words delivered with the perfect timing of someone who'd spent decades commanding audiences. "Has anyone seen our resident Shakespearean tragedy over there?" Al felt every eye in the room turn toward him. The party's ambient noise dropped several decibels as guests realized that Frank Sinatra had just called out Al Pacino in front of Hollywood's elite. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, drinks paused halfway to lips, and even the waiters seemed to slow their movements as they sensed something significant was about to unfold. Al remained motionless at the bar, his expression unchanged, but every instinct honed by years of dealing with hostile critics and difficult directors told him that Frank Sinatra had just declared war. "Al Pacino!" Sinatra called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made ignoring him impossible. "Come over here and join the civilized conversation. We were just discussing the difference between entertaining people and putting them to sleep." The insult was delivered with such casual cruelty, wrapped in such apparent friendliness, that several guests actually gasped. This wasn't playful celebrity banter, this was a deliberate public humiliation, designed to establish hierarchy and put a rising star in his place. Al set his scotch down on the bar with deliberate care, his movement controlled but carrying an undercurrent of building energy that made Robert Mitchum take a step back. "Here we go," Mitchum muttered under his breath. Al walked across the ballroom with measured steps, his path creating a corridor through the crowd as guests moved aside to watch what was rapidly becoming the most anticipated confrontation in recent Hollywood history. The sound of his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence, each step building tension like a drumbeat announcing the start of an execution. When Al reached Sinatra's circle, he stopped just outside the inner ring of admirers, his posture respectful but not deferential. "Frank," he said simply, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's silence. Sinatra's smile was predatory, the expression of someone who just lured his prey into optimal striking distance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to his audience, "Al Pacino, the man who's made brooding and mumbling into an art form." The attack was surgical, targeting everything Al had built his reputation on while maintaining the facade of good-natured ribbing. Several of Sinatra's inner circle laughed on cue, understanding that their job was to amplify whatever performance Frank decided to deliver. "Tell me, Al," Sinatra continued, his blue eyes sparkling with malicious amusement, "when you're preparing for all those intense, psychological roles, do you practice being miserable, or does it come naturally?" The insult hit its target perfectly. Al's entire artistic approach, the psychological preparation, the emotional commitment, the willingness to explore darkness, had just been reduced to self-indulgent misery by one of entertainment's biggest legends. But Al didn't react. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, dark eyes focused on Sinatra's face, waiting for the performance to continue. "Because I've got to tell you," Sinatra said, his voice gaining confidence from the audience's attention. "Audiences come to movies to escape their problems, not to watch actors have nervous breakdowns on screen. We're supposed to be entertainers, not therapists." The criticism was devastating in its precision. Sinatra had just dismissed method acting as self-indulgent therapy, suggesting that Al's entire artistic philosophy was fundamentally misguided. "But maybe that's the difference between your generation and mine," Sinatra continued, his voice taking on the tone of an elder statesman dispensing wisdom. "We understood that our job was to give people what they wanted, not to inflict our personal psychology on paying customers." The final insult was perfectly calibrated, suggesting that Al was not only artistically wrong but generationally irrelevant, a relic of misguided modern thinking rather than a serious artist. The ballroom remained completely silent, every guest understanding that they were witnessing either the destruction of Al Pacino's reputation or the beginning of something even more dramatic. Al stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable, his breathing controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Frank, can I tell you a story?" But the story Al was about to tell would do more than just answer Sinatra's insults, it would redefine what everyone present understood about the relationship between entertainment and art. But the story Al was about to tell would do more than just answer Sinatra's insults, it would redefine what everyone present understood about the relationship between entertainment and art. Sinatra's confident smile flickered slightly, perhaps sensing that Al's calm response wasn't the submissive acceptance he'd expected. "Sure, kid," he said, his voice carrying just enough condescension to remind everyone who was supposed to be in control of this conversation. "Tell us a story." Al looked around the silent ballroom, taking in the faces of Hollywood's elite who were watching this confrontation with the fascination of people witnessing a potential execution. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality than before, not defensive, not angry, just quietly powerful. 3 months ago, Al began, I was preparing for a role, and I spent time with a man named Vincent, a Vietnam veteran who'd been struggling with what we now call PTSD. He agreed to help me understand what it meant to carry psychological wounds that never heal. The ballroom remained completely silent, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't what anyone had expected, not a defensive counterattack, but something that felt more like testimony. Vincent told me about a night in Saigon when his unit was ambushed. He watched his best friend die in his arms, and for 30 seconds, he had to keep fighting while holding someone he loved more than his own brother. He said that 30 seconds taught him more about human nature than the previous 22 years of his life combined. Al's voice gained strength as he continued, his words carrying the kind of authenticity that made everyone listening lean forward despite themselves. He said that in those 30 seconds, he discovered that love and violence could exist in the same moment, that you could be saving someone's life while taking someone else's, that courage and terror were often indistinguishable from each other. Sinatra's expression had begun to change, his predatory confidence replaced by something approaching uncertainty. This wasn't the response he'd scripted for, and he clearly had no idea where Al was going with this story. Vincent asked me something that night, Al continued, his voice taking on more intensity. He asked me if I thought audiences wanted to understand what he'd experienced, or if they just wanted to be entertained by a sanitized version that wouldn't disturb their sleep. Al paused, letting the question hang in the air like smoke from a gunshot. The silence in the ballroom was now complete, even the waiters having stopped their movement to listen. And I told him that I thought some audiences, not all, but some, were brave enough to handle the truth. That some people were strong enough to watch an actor disappear into the psychology of someone who'd lived through hell and come back changed. Al stepped closer to Sinatra, his movement controlled but commanding. Because that's what method acting really is, Frank. It's not self-indulgent therapy. It's not brooding for the sake of brooding. It's the willingness to explore the parts of human experience that most people never have to face, so that audiences can understand something true about what it means to be human. The attack was surgical, delivered with such quiet conviction that even Sinatra's most loyal supporters found themselves questioning their automatic agreement with their leader. You say we're supposed to give audiences what they want, Al continued, his voice gaining power. But what if what they really want, deep down, beneath all the surface entertainment, is to feel less alone in their own struggles? What if they want to see someone explore the darkness they carry inside themselves but never talk about? Al looked around the ballroom, making eye contact with faces that were now watching him with genuine attention rather than social curiosity. When someone watches Michael Corleone's transformation from war hero to ruthless Don, they're not being entertained by violence. They're confronting the question of what they would sacrifice to protect the people they love. When they watch Frank Serpico struggle with corruption, they're examining their own relationship with moral compromise. The room was electric with tension now, as everyone present understood that Al had turned Sinatra's attack into something much more significant, a fundamental examination of what art was supposed to accomplish. That's not inflicting psychology on paying customers, Frank, Al said, his voice taking on an edge that made several guests step closer. That's offering them the chance to understand themselves better through someone else's experience. Sinatra's famous composure was now visibly strained. This wasn't the defensive response he'd expected from a younger actor being publicly humiliated. This was a masterclass in artistic philosophy, delivered with such passionate conviction that it was impossible to dismiss. But you want to know what Vincent taught me about entertainment? Al asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. He told me that the night his friend died, the only thing that got him through the next 6 hours of combat was remembering a song his mother used to sing when he was scared as a child. A simple song, nothing complex or psychological, just a melody that reminded him that love existed even in the middle of hell. Al looked directly at Sinatra, his expression shifting to something approaching respect. And you know what song it was, Frank? In the wee small hours of the morning. Your song. Your voice, singing about loneliness and hope in the darkness. The revelation hit Sinatra like a physical blow. His most famous ballad, the song that had defined his artistic legacy, had literally helped keep a combat soldier alive during the worst night of his life. Vincent said that when he heard your voice in his memory, he understood something profound about what entertainment could accomplish, Al continued, his voice now carrying genuine admiration. That sometimes, giving audiences what they want means showing them that they're not alone in their pain. That someone else has felt what they feel and survived it. The ballroom was completely still, everyone understanding that Al had just transformed an attack into something approaching tribute. So when you ask about the difference between our generations, Al said, I think the difference isn't about methodology. It's about scope. You showed people they weren't alone in their loneliness. I try to show them they're not alone in their complexity. Al stepped back slightly, his posture shifting to something more conversational but no less powerful. Both approaches require disappearing into something larger than yourself, whether it's the emotional truth of a 3-minute song or the psychological truth of a 2-hour character study. Both require the courage to explore feelings that most people keep hidden. Sinatra stood motionless, his legendary quick wit apparently deserting him for the first time in decades. The man who'd made a career of having the perfect response to any situation seemed genuinely at a loss for words. Vincent died 2 months ago, Al said, his voice taking on a different quality. Overdose. The same psychological wounds that helped me create authentic characters eventually destroyed a real human being who never got the help he needed. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, as everyone in the room processed the weight of what Al had just shared. So when I spend months preparing for roles, when I explore the darkness that you call unnecessarily complicated, I'm not doing it for self-indulgent artistic reasons, Al said, his voice gaining strength again. I'm doing it because people like Vincent deserve to have their stories told truthfully. They deserve to have audiences understand what they sacrificed and what it cost them. Al looked around the ballroom one final time, his gaze taking in faces that were now watching him with something approaching reverence. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, if that seems too intense or too psychological for audiences who just want to be entertained, then maybe those people aren't ready for the kind of art that actually changes lives instead of just passing time. Al returned his attention to Sinatra, who remained completely silent, his famous charm utterly absent for what might have been the first time in his adult life. But I want to thank you, Frank, Al said, his voice returning to the respectful tone he'd used at the beginning of their encounter. Because Vincent's story taught me that the best entertainment, whether it's a song that saves someone's life or a performance that helps them understand their own struggle, comes from the same place. It comes from artists who aren't afraid to explore the full range of human experience and share what they discover. Al extended his hand to Sinatra, a gesture of respect that somehow felt more powerful than any insult could have been. We're not different generations of entertainers, Frank. We're different instruments in the same orchestra, trying to help people understand that their pain and their hope and their complexity are shared by others who've walked similar paths. Sinatra stared at Al's extended hand for what felt like an eternity, his expression cycling through confusion, surprise, and finally something that might have been recognition. When he finally reached out and shook Al's hand, the gesture was firm and genuine. That's, Sinatra began, then stopped, seemingly unable to find words adequate to the moment. For perhaps the first time in his legendary career, Frank Sinatra was genuinely speechless. The ballroom remained silent for several more seconds before someone began to applaud, first one person, then another, until the entire room was giving Al a standing ovation that lasted nearly 3 minutes. When the applause finally died down, Sinatra had regained some of his composure, though his famous arrogance was notably absent. Al, he said quietly, I think I owe you an apology. And maybe I need to understand better what you do. The party gradually resumed its normal rhythm, but everyone present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented, a moment when defensive confrontation had been transformed into mutual understanding through the power of authentic storytelling. Years later, when entertainment journalists wrote about the relationship between old Hollywood and the method acting revolution, Al's response to Sinatra's attack would be cited as a defining moment. Proof that great art transcends generational differences and that the most powerful responses to criticism come not from anger, but from a deeper understanding of what artistic work is supposed to accomplish. Frank Sinatra never again made dismissive comments about method acting, and privately told friends that his encounter with Al Pacino had taught him something important about the difference between performing and truth-telling. And Al never forgot the lesson he'd learned that night. That sometimes the most effective way to defend your artistic choices is not to attack your critics, but to help them understand the human experiences that make those choices necessary.